Hello everyone, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Really excited to be creating with some of the newly released products from Honeybee Stamps. It is their 5th anniversary and they're celebrating it big with a huge release. So I am using the new Farm Fresh Flowers stamp set. I have some Distress watercolor paper in my mini Misty here, and I'm stamping onto the smooth side of it with my VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. And then pulled those stamps off, and then there's a couple different little sentiments in the set that you can use to stamp on the little label piece of this old, it's like a galvanized, milk pail. So stamp that. And then I am going to do some really simple watercoloring just using a couple of my Prima watercolor sets. So the first one, I'm just using the classic set because I wanted the gray for this, of course. So I'm just using my Zen watercolor brush. I get the area wet first with clean water, and then I pick up the watercolor, painting it on, and then I just kind of move it around. So I have, some darker areas and some lighter areas. And that's it. Super simple. So I'm doing the same thing again for the base of this with that gray. Just got the area wet with clean water, painting on the gray watercolor, and then moving the color around with just a little bit of clean water on my brush. And then I quickly dry this with my heat tool because I wanted to paint a little bit on the label as well, and I don't want that like bleeding into the gray area. So I let it dry, or sped up the drying. You can always let it just air dry, but as always, I'm impatient. So dried it, and then I'm using now the pastel watercolor set from Prima, like one of my favorite watercolor sets. This one I've used a lot. So I use the pastels now. That's it. That's all I'm going to use. I'm using it for all of these little florals, and I've switched to a smaller brush. This is a size 2. It's tiny. But I wanted a smaller brush because there's a lot of little areas, like little petals and all that sort of thing. So I just start going in and painting. I've sped this up in editing, so it's about 800 times faster than what it actually took me. It didn't take that long, honestly. I kept the watercolor simple, just laying down color. I, mix some of these colors together, but since I'm working with the pastels, they all kind of just go together. So I did a nice little pale pink on the tulips, and then I'm doing some yellow on this flower, and then I'm going to start mixing the yellow and the deeper pink shade just to kind of give it, some different color and some definition and whatnot. So I just go in and paint it, and then I'm just going to keep doing this, just going around and painting little different areas. This is one of the few times where I did not do any embossing when I stamp the images, because usually I stamp, whether I stamp it in black and emboss with clear, or I'll stamp and heat emboss it with white emboss powder, then do my watercoloring. This time I didn't do that because these images are so detailed, especially like the little lilac sprig here in this bouquet. If I was to heat emboss this, you almost wouldn't be able to add color in the end because the embossing powder would take up too much room, if that makes sense. So this time I just moved around a little bit more so that I'm not, bleeding colors. Like I said, I'm impatient. But as long as I'm not painting one area next to the other one before they have a chance to dry, it's just fine. So and that's what I do. I just kind of skip around and paint different areas so that each area can dry, and then I don't have to worry about bleeding colors, and I'm good to go. So I stuck to a kind of minty color palette especially with the greenery and whatnot. I don't know, I was in a very mint green mood when I made this card. So I already knew I wanted to use mint green for the bulk of the card, like on the background and whatnot. So that's why I kind of stuck with that with greenery as well. And then I just kept going along and adding color. So once I got to these little sort of berry images where I just added that sort of darker pink, and then I actually mixed the darker pink and the lighter pink and just added a second layer to the tulips, just to give them that little bit extra color, that little bit extra definition. And then the flower centers, there's 2 different shades of brown watercolor in this little palette. So I just ended up actually mixing them both together to get just a darker shade of brown for the flower centers. And then that was it. Once I was done painting all this, I made sure it was completely dry before I do any sort of die cutting, anything like that. You never want to die cut something that you've colored that is still wet, because if you use any sort of tape, it'll tear, but there's also the chance too that it could end up like sticking to your like die cutting plates, that sort of thing. So always want to make sure it's completely dry, which I did. So then I was able to tape the coordinating wafer dies to this Farm Fresh Flowers stamp set into place with some washi tape. And then once the dies are taped into place, I'm just going to run this through my die cut machine. After I'm done die cutting, I want to create the background for my card. So this time I pulled out my Misty. As usual, I'm switching between like the Misty, Mini Misty. You don't need both or multiples, but generally you end up with several, after a few years. So anywho, I pulled out my Misty because I needed the larger one because I'm using the new Buffalo Plaid background stamp. This is a clear stamp, so I don't need to pull out the foam for my Misty like I do with red rubber background stamps. So I have another piece of distressed watercolor paper, again, smooth side facing up. And I used my anti-static powder tool on it. And then I am stamping this Buffalo Plaid background with clear embossing ink. I'm not being super careful with it. I just wanted the pattern. I didn't want like a perfect background. I kind of wanted a little bit of a distressed look. So I'm pouring white embossing powder over it. So of course, on camera right now, it looks boring. You can't really see anything. But pouring the white embossing powder over it, once I've got the entire background covered with the embossing powder, I'm going to melt this with my heat tool, tilting it back and forth in the light to make sure, because especially when it's white on white, it's hard to see. So any grainy or dull areas aren't melted. Made sure they're melted. And then I'm going to sponge on cracked pistachio distress oxide ink using my Ranger Mini Ink blending tool. And I start in the center. So I loaded up the tool with extra ink, started in the center, and then worked my way out. And I'm not adding any more ink. I wanted it to kind of fade out as I got to the edges. I didn't want a perfect blend. I didn't want, complete coverage. I just wanted it to have the color and then kind of fade out nicely on the edges. So did that, and then I also decided to do another piece with just the ink because I thought that would look really cute with the wafer die I'm going to use. So I took another piece of the distressed watercolor paper and then just blended on more of that cracked pistachio distress oxide ink, just kind of starting from the bottom of the piece and again just letting it like fade out a little bit. And then once I was happy with that, I'm actually going to trim down that piece because I don't want to get any splatter or anything on the top part because I'm not using that. So then I can save that piece for other things. And to get the splatter, I want to add the cracked pistachio color. So I just put the lid back on and I smush the lid into the ink pad. So it's going to collect some ink right inside the ink pad lid. And then I'm going to take my watercolor brush, add just a little bit of clean water, swirl that around, and now I've got some little splatter I can add to both of these pieces. So just picking up the color, tapping it with my brush so I get splatter all over the background, and then again, letting everything dry. This time, not so much. I'm not as worried about, tearing or anything when it's splatter, but if it's not dry when you die cut it, you're going to get the splatter all over your die cutting plates, etc., etc., and it's just going to make a big mess. Ask me how I know that one. Again, sometimes my impatience, anyway, everything was dry. I'm going to do some die cutting. I'm going to die cut that Buffalo Plaid background with the largest of the Scallop A2 honey cuts. This came out quite some time ago. This is still one of my favorite wafer die sets. So because it cuts that cute little scallop edge, plus it adds that little stitching edge to it as well. So I trimmed it down with that wafer die, and then I die cut the blended piece with the new Friend Honey Cuts die from Honeybee. And then I also die cut just some white cardstock so I can stack these together because I like having that dimension and whatnot with my sentiments. So I'm just going to stack 2 layers of just the white cardstock die cuts. And then I'm going to add that one that I blended and splattered on top. And I'm going to do the same thing to the little tittle. That word just still makes me want to smirk like a 12-year-old. Laura Basson gets credit though for that. I actually did not know that that's what you called the dots to eyes. So watching her videos, you always pick up the most random little things. It's just hilarious. So anyway, added those. Got everything kind of together. So now I want to finish the sentiment. So I actually just took the little hello stamp from the Farm Fresh Flowers stamp set. I'm actually stamping on the scrap that I die cut the friend words from. And I'm going to stamp that with that VersaFine Claire Nocturne ink. And then my finished watercolor piece I added with some foam dimension to the buffalo plaid background. And then the friend word, the first part of it, I put a little bit of my Darice foam strips on the back of it so that they could adhere and not get smooshed. And then just adhesive on the rest of it so I could pop that on top of my main images here. And I did the same thing with the tittle to the eye, just added the teeniest little bit of the foam tape and then popped that into place, and then did the same thing with the hello word. So after I've got that assembled, I want to do the inside of my card. So my card base is a side folding A2 size card. So I just kind of lined it up in my MISTI, not perfectly, but I wanted the like kind of inside edge not pressed up right against the edge of the MISTI, so I could stamp that cluster of flowers in the lower corner of it using that same cracked pistachio Distress Oxide ink. So after I did that, I then took the Miss You stamp from the Coordinating Friend stamp set that coordinates with the new Honeycuts dies. And I lined that up, and I'm going to stamp that with that VersaFine Claire Nocturne ink. And I'm going to stamp it twice with that just to intensify it a little bit. And then after that's stamped, I can now adhere my card front to my card base. As always, you could leave it here, but I want to add just a little bit of bling. So I pulled out some Blossom Sparkle crystals, and I'm going to kind of sprinkle these throughout my little card front here. And same thing, just adhere them into place with the Craft Tacky glue. So I've got my card front adhered with its scalloped minty goodness. And then I'm going to add these crystals all around, around and on top of my image here, just to kind of pull out a little bit more of the pink, because pink and mint green are like the perfect combo. Love it. Makes me think of ice cream. Anyway, gonna adhere these into place, and once these are adhered, this card is complete. So as always, I will have a link below the video to the blog post. I will have a supply list with links to all the supplies used, so you can check that out below as well as on the blog if you are interested. Just check out the description box below the video. Thank you all so much for watching, for subscribing, for thumbs upping, for commenting. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!